Please join me in welcoming Noam Chomsky to Manchester.
Tell me this isn't working. It is? Yeah, I'm not a great believer in conspiracy theories, but I'm getting the couple of days I've been in England, I've been developing some suspicions about the British Secret Service. I gave a talk in Oxford 2 days ago, some huge auditorium. The minute I started talking, all the power went out. And it's one of the reasons I'm hoarse. I had to scream for an hour and a half. The minute I stopped talking, the power went on. And then when I heard this one go off, I figured this can't be a coincidence. So I expect this to go off any minute. We've just passed, as you know, the first anniversary of the President's declaration of victory in Iraq. I'm sure you saw the television pictures, the carefully staged extravaganza on the aircraft carrier properly placed in the harbor for the right views of the setting sun or whatever it was. I'm not going to speak about what's happening in Iraq on the ground. There's more than enough information about that coming. We can all draw our own conclusions. Instead, what I'd like to do is to comment on the new Imperial Grand Strategy that was supposed to be set in motion with the conquest of Iraq, and where it stands today, actually much less successful than I had predicted, and what that implies about what's coming next. The phrase, New Imperial Grand Strategy, I should make clear, is not mine, nor incidentally is the phrase the world's second superpower. The phrase "the world's second superpower" comes from a very unhappy New York Times article reporting the mid-February 2003 demonstrations around the world and saying, well, it seems there are now two superpowers in the United States and world public opinion. I'm not particularly happy about that, but it's an accurate description. The phrase New Imperial Grand Strategy comes from the main establishment foreign policy journal in the United States, the Journal of Foreign Affairs of the Council on Foreign Relations. It appeared in an article that was published immediately within weeks after the release of the Bush administration National Security Strategy. It was September 2002, which was accompanied by a virtual announcement of the plan to invade Iraq. The UN was informed right away that it could be relevant, it's the word that the government used, they could be relevant by agreeing to authorize what the United States was going to do anyway, with Britain loyally following behind, in what's called a partnership, I think. I must say, when I got to England a couple of days ago, I saw a speech by Tony Blair reported in which he said he was going to stand shoulder to shoulder with George Bush. And the unkind phrase that immediately came to mind was shoulder to knee with George Bush, but it's too impolite to say, so I withdraw it. It announced the intention. The UN was told it could be relevant by authorizing it. Otherwise, it could go on, but it could be, as Colin Powell explained to them, they could be a debating society. Those are the choices for the world. The National Security Strategy itself was a very clear, forthright declaration of the intention to dominate the world indefinitely, by force if necessary, the one dimension in which the United States still reigns supreme, overwhelmingly so, and to destroy any perceived potential challenge to this dominance. And the invasion of Iraq was to be the illustration of the doctrine. Well, the doctrine itself, quite apart from the plans to invade, led to unprecedented protest around the world, including, interestingly, the foreign policy elite within the United States, pretty much across the board. It's, again, unprecedented. So in the journal Foreign Affairs, the main establishment journal, the new Imperial Grand Strategy, as it was called, was immediately criticized within weeks as a threat, as dangerous, a threat to the United States and to the world. And the elite criticism was remarkably broad, but it was also quite narrow. It's not that the principle was wrong. There's very little criticism of the principle, but rather of the style of its presentation and the manner of its implementation. The basic thrust of the criticism was captured rather well by Madeleine Albright, Clinton's Secretary of State, also in the journal Foreign Affairs, in one of a series of articles about this. She pointed out that every president has a similar doctrine, but the president keeps it in his back pocket, kind of quiet about it, pulls it out to use when necessary, and that it's a serious error to sort of smash people in the face with it and to implement it in brazen defiance, even of allies, and to make it clear to them you have total contempt for them, let alone the rest of the world. That's foolish and dangerous. And that was the basic character of the criticism. Very broad, but also very thin. Albright herself, of course, knew that Clinton had a similar doctrine. She had been UN ambassador under Clinton, and in that capacity, she had informed the United Nations that the United States will act multilaterally when it can and unilaterally when it must. And when she went on to become Secretary of State, she was, of course, aware of the regular White House messages to Congress, where the meaning of that was spelled out. Clinton declared the right to use force to ensure access to markets and resources, even without the pretexts that Bush and Blair conjured up. Taken literally, the Clinton doctrine goes far beyond the national security strategy, use force to ensure access to markets and resources. But it was issued quietly. Messages to Congress. If Parliament is anything like Congress, nobody was listening or probably reading comic books or something. But it was quiet, it wasn't reported, and it wasn't issued in a way to be offensive. And the implementation was similar. It was implemented, but in ways that allowed allies and others to feel that somehow their worth was higher than zero. And as Albright correctly pointed out in the same article, this doctrine goes far back, has a long tradition. She didn't give the details, but in the United States, you can find the same doctrine in virtually the same words as the Bush strategy back as early as 1941, before the United States entered the war. The war was going on, but the U.S. wasn't in it yet. And the State Department and the Council on Foreign Relations were running extensive sessions on how to run the post-war world. It was clear at that time that the United States would emerge as the world dominant power. Britain would be what the Foreign Office here later called a junior partner to the United States, and nobody would come close to the U.S. in wealth or power, and therefore it would be their task to organize the world, and in the plans to do so, I won't bother quoting it, but the wording is approximately the same as the national security strategy. But again, that was quiet. It was public, but it was never reported. You can't find it in scholarship. It's only known by people who have to know it. And it wasn't, it wasn't done with brazen arrogance. And of course, there are plenty of other precedents outside the United States. Britain has a miserable, ugly, and vicious record, which I don't have to tell you about, and the continental powers are no different, the same elsewhere. Nevertheless, despite the rich precedent, the new Imperial Grand Strategy was understood to be highly significant. Henry Kissinger wrote about it. He called it a revolutionary new doctrine. And as he observed, it tears to shreds, publicly and openly, the 17th century system of international order, the so-called Westphalian system. Of course, it also throws into the ash can the UN Charter and international law. I think Kissinger apparently considered that too insignificant to mention, but it does. Kissinger felt that this revolutionary new doctrine was the correct one, but he also criticized, cautioned really about the style and the implementation. And he added a very crucial qualification, which is usually tacit. He said the doctrine is fine, but it cannot be universalized. That is, it's the United States alone that has the right of aggression at will. The U.S. may delegate it to clients, but the doctrine can't be a universal doctrine. So in other words, we must forcefully reject the most elementary of moral truisms, namely that we apply to ourselves the same standards that we apply to others. And Kissinger should be congratulated, in my opinion, for his honesty in correctly articulating doctrines that are prevailing but are usually concealed in rhetoric about virtuous intent and tortured legalisms and so on. He just said it straight out. Moral standards are not for us. We use force, nobody else does, and that cannot be universalized. That's good, that's clear. There was also some, not much, but some critical commentary on the new doctrine on quite different grounds. One, from an interesting source, was an article by Arthur Schlesinger, perhaps the most respected living American historian, Kennedy advisor and memoirist. As the bombs began to fall on Baghdad a year ago, Schlesinger wrote an article in which he recalled the words of Franklin Delano Roosevelt when Japan bombed Pearl Harbor on what Roosevelt called a date which will live in infamy. And Schlesinger said Roosevelt was correct, and now it is Americans who live in infamy as the government adopts the policies of Imperial Japan. That was a unique, honest, near unique, honest criticism in the mainstream. He also added that the Bush administration had succeeded in converting a global wave of sympathy for the United States to a global wave of hatred for American arrogance and militancy. That was a year ago. Polls more recently show that it's far more extreme, and as you know from other very intensive polls in Iraq taken by British and American polling institutions, and the United States and Britain have succeeded in doing the same thing in Iraq. They've converted an initial wave of at least tolerance, if not sympathy, to intense hatred. I mean, they have even succeeded, according to the most recent published poll, in turning Muqtada al-Sadr into the second most admired figure in Iraq, second only to the Grand Ayatollah. And by now, polls show about, among Iraqi Arabs, 12 to 1. By 12 to 1, they regard the U.S. and Britain as an occupying force, not a liberating force. If you add Kurds who have their own aspirations, it gets down, according to the latest polls, to 9 to 1, which is unprecedented. I mean, the Germans didn't have that much opposition in occupied Europe. And that is an achievement. To have achieved that is a sign of some talent. It was also anticipated that the war would increase the threat of terror. That was predicted by most specialists and intelligence agencies, and that's happened as well. There are Middle East specialists who monitor attitudes in the Muslim world, and they express themselves to be astonished, I'm quoting, by the revival of the appeal of global jihadi Islam that had been in decline. Recruitment for al-Qaeda networks increased. Iraq, which had had no ties to terror before, became what Harvard's leading specialist on terrorism calls a terrorist haven. Iraq suffered its first suicide attacks since the 13th century. The suicide bombings last year, the year 2003, reached their highest level in modern times. And the year ended in the United States with a terrorism alert of unprecedented severity. On the anniversary of the invasion, the Grand Central Station in New York, the major rail station, was patrolled by heavily armed police with flak jackets and submachine guns. This was, of course, a reaction to the bombing in Madrid shortly before, the worst terrorist crime in Europe. A few days after the Madrid bombing, Spain voted out the government that had gone to war against the will of the overwhelming majority of the population, and had indeed been highly praised by U.S. and other Western intellectuals for showing its democratic credentials by following orders from Crawford, Texas, instead of and dismissing maybe 90% of the population. That was quite general at the time. But they voted out the government a few days after the Madrid bombing. Spain was no longer praised. It was then bitterly condemned for appeasing terrorists by voting the government out. Actually, what the Spanish voters voted for was withdrawal of troops unless they were under UN authorization. The commentators who condemned the Spanish voters for their weakness and cowardice failed to point out that this is essentially the position of about 70% of Americans, and it has been pretty much for about a year. Large majority, now 70%, holds that the United Nations should take the lead in Iraq in civil order control, security issues, economic reconstruction, working with Iraqis to establish some democratic government. There are differences between the United States and Spain, some crucial ones. In Spain, people know what public opinion is. In the United States, only those who do research projects know what public opinion is. You can find it out. There are intensive studies of public opinion. The other difference is that in Spain, people can vote on this issue. In the United States right now, it's just inconceivable. This could not enter the electoral agenda. You can draw your own conclusions from that. Ask yourself questions about England. There is a curious performance underway right now I think it would intrigue some independent Martian observer. It's going on in Washington and in Western commentary in general. There's a very lively debate about whether the Bush administration downgraded the so-called war on terror in favor of its ambitions in Iraq. This was based on revelations by recent Bush administration officials, which I'm sure you've seen. The only thing that was surprising about those revelations is that anybody finds them surprising, particularly right now, when it is so clear that by invading Iraq, they did exactly that. That is, they consciously increased the threat of terror in order to achieve their goals in Iraq. And in the face of this dramatic demonstration, what is there to discuss? Well, apparently a lot. Even without this dramatic demonstration of their priorities, the point should have been obvious. From the point of view of administration, and it's pretty rational, from the point of view of administration planners, just think it through. Terror might kill thousands of Americans, but that's been obvious since 1993. 1993, Islamic jihadists organized by the United States and their British associates and others practically blew up the World Trade Center. They failed, but only because of bad planning. If it planned a little better, they would have killed tens of thousands of people. It was certainly obvious then what could happen. And in fact, the risk assessment for terrorism did not change on September 11th. It's the same when an effort happens to fail and when an effort happens to succeed, same risk. And if you look at the technical publications through the 90s, this is pointed out regularly. So yes, they know that a terrorist attack could kill thousands of Americans, but that's just not very important in comparison with the establishing the first secure military bases in a dependent client state, which is itself a huge has huge resources, and right in the center of the world's major energy reserves. I mean, that is really important. Back in the 1940s, same time that post-war planning was going on, the State Department pointed out that the resources of the Gulf region are what they called a stupendous source of strategic power and one of the greatest material prizes in world history. So of course, one of the highest priorities was to make sure you take control of them. Notice the United States did not use the oil. The U.S. itself was North America's the major producer until about 1970. But the point is not using the resources, it's controlling them. And that was understood. George Kennan, one of the leading planners, way out at the humane dovish side, pointed out that we have to do this, we have to take control of the resources, because it gives us veto power over what others might do, primarily our allies. They have to be kept under control, and controlling the resources gives veto power. That's now understood as well, of course. So it's just perfectly natural that Wolfowitz, Cheney, Rumsfeld, other planners were regarded control over this, attaining this tremendous, expanding this tremendous lever of world control as far more significant than terror. And it's not, you shouldn't be in the least surprised that they and their British counterparts were pressing the intelligence communities to provide some shred of evidence, however thin, to justify the invasion. Weapons of mass destruction, ties to terror, anything would do. And there are plenty of other indications that those are the priorities, quite dramatic ones right now. So just take, say, last week. Last week, George Bush imposed sanctions on Syria. That was in accord with an act passed by Congress last December, the Syria Accountability Act, which is a virtual declaration of war against Syria. And this was the implementation of it. Well, what's the effect of that war, of the sanctions? The main effect is to deprive the United States of an extremely valuable source of information on Al-Qaeda-style terrorism, which Syria doesn't like one bit. And they've been cooperating and providing information on these groups to U.S. intelligence. Syria is, and this now cuts it off. So what's more important, what's so important that you have to cut off a major source of information about terrorism? Well, that's pretty clear. Syria is refusing to accept U.S. orders on how to organize the Middle East. And making sure you get obedience is far more important than the war on terror. So we have another dramatic demonstration of the priorities. Actually, Syria technically is on what's called the list. There is a list of states that support terror, and Syria is on the list. The CIA acknowledges that Syria hasn't been involved in any suspected support for terror for at least 15 years. And we can tell just how serious this concern is by Clinton's offer to Syria to take them off the list of states supporting terror if they would agree to U.S.-Israeli proposals for how to resolve the Golan Heights issue. When Syria insisted on regaining its territory, the territory that had been conquered. They were kept on the state list supporting terror. It tells anybody who wants to know just what that list is. If you want to know more about it, look back a little. In the roughly 25 years since the list of states supporting terror has been functioning, one state has been removed from it, namely Iraq, under Saddam Hussein. Iraq was removed under the Reagan administration from states supporting terror so as to allow the United States and Britain and others freely to provide Saddam with the means to develop weapons of mass destruction with badly aided need and so on, right through the period of his worst atrocities, through the worst of them. And this continued, in fact, through the smashing of the Shiite rebellion in 1991 that might have overthrown him. I mean, now these events are brought up as proof that we somehow have to invade, and happily forgetting the fact that we supported it all along, right through that. And so Iraq was taken off the list of states supporting terror in the 80s. Now, there was a gap in the list at that point, so you had to add somebody. And the state that was added was Cuba, perhaps in recognition of the fact that the terrorist war against Cuba that the United States has been waging quite intensively since the Kennedy administration had in fact peaked to new heights of savagery in the late 1970s. So it made sense for Cuba to be added to the list of states supporting terror. All of this passes without comment in educated commentary in the West. Cuba gives you another indication of the priorities of the war on terror. The Treasury Department in the United States has an office called the Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC it's called, and it has a task. Its task is to monitor suspicious transfers of currencies internationally. Well, that's a core part of the war on terror, obviously. And OFAC does have people working on that. Four officials are working on monitoring the finances of Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda. That compares to 21 who are monitoring efforts to evade the illegal U.S. embargo on Cuba, declared illegal in every international forum. So 5 times as many people are monitoring attempts to evade the U.S. embargo on Cuba as are involved in Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda's financing. Again, tells you something about priorities. It's far more important to strangle Cuba than to fight the war on terror, just as it's far more important to invade Iraq. And we know the reasons for that, too. The United States is a very free and open society, actually the most free and open in the world, so we have huge amounts of information about government planning. Fortunately, there's a quite obedient intellectual class, so it doesn't get very far, but it's there if you want to find it. And the reasons for the war, the terrorist war against Cuba and the economic strangulation are explained very frankly, right during the Kennedy years when it began a little earlier, but really took off under Kennedy. It's explained by intelligence and State Department planners that the very, I'm quoting it, the very existence of the Castro regime is successful defiance of U.S. policies that go back to the 1820s, that is, to the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine announced the U.S. intention to control the Western Hemisphere and to keep everybody else out. The U.S. couldn't do it at that time because it had a major enemy which was too powerful, namely England. England was a deterrent. It prevented the United States from invading Canada, which it tried to do several times, and from conquering Cuba and so on. But they realized that over time the balance of forces would shift, and sooner or later the U.S. would be powerful enough and England would be weak enough so that you could implement the Monroe Doctrine, and precisely what happened. Cuba's successful defiance is violating U.S. principles that go back to the 1820s, nothing to do about Russia. Arthur Schlesinger, who was at that time the head of Kennedy's Latin American mission, provided Kennedy with a report of the mission, which said there are other reasons, more deeper reasons. It said that The danger that Cuba poses is what he called the spread of the Castro idea of taking matters into your own hands. It's an idea which might influence other people in Latin America who are suffering the same kinds of oppression and violence and so on. And if that idea spreads, you're really in trouble. That's more than just successful defiance in one place. And in fact, if you look over post-war history, post-Second World War history, that's the leading motive for intervention and violence and subversion, almost always. Something else is conjured up, but that's typically the leading motive. In any event, punishing successful defiance is far more important than fighting the war on terror. Any mafia don would understand at once, you can't accept successful defiance. That's dangerous. And you've got to make sure it's destroyed, and that's far more important than the war on terror. Well, there's case after case like this, but no matter how many examples there are and how rational the policies are, they cannot be perceived. I mean, they can't be discussed, they can't be perceived. This is a small sample. The farce that's going on in Washington now and the concern about it is just another illustration of the incapacity to perceive the obvious. It's kind of intriguing that as one pretext after another disappears and the leadership, British and American leadership, announce some new one, commentary follows along, always conspicuously evading the obvious reason, which is virtually unmentionable among Western intellectuals, at least, educated classes. Actually, not everywhere. Like in Baghdad, they perceive it. One of the U.S. polls in Baghdad last October asked Baghdadis to formulate in their own words the reasons why the United States invaded. The overwhelming majority took it for granted that the reason for the invasion was to take control of Iraq's resources and to reorganize the Middle East in U.S. interests. I'll come back to more about that poll in a minute. But they can somehow see what we can't allow ourselves to see. And that's not so unusual either. The people at the wrong end of the club quite often have a much clearer perception of understanding of the world. It's true in human relations quite generally. Well, there happens to be a very broad consensus among specialists as to how to reduce the threat of terror, if anybody's interested. I should mention here that I'm following a deplorable convention, so I apologize, but I'll keep to it. The convention is that the term terror is restricted to the subcategory of terror that they carry out against us. Excluded is the usually far greater terror that we carry out against them. That's not terror. That's self-defense or noble, generous impulses or some other term. So I'll keep to that, but with this reservation. So just keeping to that terror, there's a clear consensus on how to reduce it, and there's also very strong, clear consensus on how to incite further terrorist atrocities. And sooner or later, these are going to become truly horrendous. It's just a matter of time before terror and weapons of mass destruction are linked, and the consequences could be awful. But that's not considered important enough to act to reduce the threat of terror, though it's understood. It was understood long before September 11th, I should say. The Iraq invasion is quite typical. It did increase the threat of terror, as expected, and that's common. Violence quite commonly elicits greater violence in response. There are some very good detailed investigations of Al-Qaeda, the best ones by a British journalist, analyst, Jason Burke. I'll sort of follow his analysis, but it's standard. Al-Qaeda, incidentally, as he points out, is not an organization. There's no such thing. It's kind of a loose network of often not even affiliated organizations which have more or less similar doctrines and have maybe some connections and so on. So it's kind of a loose array of networks. We'll call it Al-Qaeda. He points out that Al-Qaeda was essentially unknown In fact, if you look at U.S. intelligence records, not even mentioned. And bin Laden was considered a very insignificant figure until 1998, when Clinton bombed Afghanistan and the Sudan. Now, that led immediately to a sharp increase in support, recruitment, financing for al-Qaeda-style networks. It turned bin Laden into a major figure, which he had not been before. And it also forged close relations between bin Laden and the Taliban. The relations before had been cool or hostile. Just on the side, we learn something more about ourselves, always the most important topic, by looking at the reaction in the West to those bombings. So take, say, the Sudan. In the Sudan, Clinton bombed what he and intelligence knew was the major source of pharmaceutical supplies in the Sudan and veterinary medicines. If terrorists blew up, say, half the pharmaceutical supplies in some country that matters, like, say, England or the United States or Israel, we'd know about it and care about it. And of course, the effects are much worse in a poor country like Sudan. The few credible estimates that exist are that this led to the death of tens of thousands of people. But this does not enter the annals of terrorism for the reasons I mentioned. It's not something they did to us. And there's very little interest. In fact, interest is non-existent, and no one bothers to investigate, apart from a few who reach that conclusion. Well, that's not at all unusual. In fact, it's quite typical. Again, those at the wrong end of the clubs, they tend to view these things rather differently. Well, going back to how to incite terror, after Clinton's bombing in 1998, the next major contribution to the growth of al-Qaeda and the prominence of bin Laden was the bombing of Afghanistan. This was without any credible pretext. That was conceded months later, quietly. That led to a sharp increase in recruitment and enthusiasm for what was by then being called the cosmic struggle between good and evil. And that's the rhetoric which is shared by bin Laden and George Bush's speechwriters. I'm assuming that bin Laden writes his own orations. Reviewing many examples of this kind, Burke concludes that every use of force is, as he puts it, another small victory for bin Laden. And that kind of conclusion is quite widely shared. Among others, it's shared by Israeli heads of Israeli military intelligence and the general security services, adapted to their own context, but essentially the same point. There are new illustrations of this principle almost daily. So take the worst atrocity so far in single atrocity in Iraq, the Marine invasion of Fallujah, which killed hundreds, maybe more people. We don't know because we don't care. We don't investigate our own crimes, typically. The invasion of Fallujah was the response to the killing of 4 American security contractors in Fallujah. Responsibility for those killings was taken by a new organization which called itself Brigades of Martyr Ahmed Yassin. They were avenging the murder a few days earlier of the quadriplegic cleric, Sheikh Yassin, and about half a dozen bystanders as he left a mosque in Gaza. This is described in the West as an Israeli assassination. That's not accurate. He was killed by a U.S. helicopter flown by an Israeli pilot. Israel doesn't make helicopters. The helicopters are sent to Israel by the United States with the knowledge that that's the way they're going to be used. They're not used in self-defense. They're used for things like targeted assassinations and other atrocities. So it's a U.S.-Israeli assassination. Just in the several months before that, the 5 months before the killing of Sheikh Yassin, so-called targeted assassinations, had mostly by helicopters and missiles, had killed about 50 suspects and approximately 80 or 90 bystanders. Well, in the Fallujah case, you trace the chain of violence, the straight line from the U.S.-Israeli assassination of Sheikh Yassin up to the conflagration in Iraq, which practically went out of control. And that was known right away, but virtually silenced in the media, in the United States at least. In the United States, there's a healthy skepticism about the media, so it's carefully studied, but not so in other countries. You can check here. There's also a broad consensus among the same specialists on how to reduce the threat of terror, and it's perfectly reasonable. Terrorists regard themselves as a vanguard. They're trying to mobilize a constituency, and therefore an effort to reduce terror will be two-pronged. We'll be concerned with the terrorists and with their constituency. With regard to the terrorists themselves, they're carrying out criminal acts, and criminal acts you respond to with police work. And it's been quite successful. In Europe, in South Asia, Southeast Asia, there's been very successful dismantling of many of the terrorist networks just through police work. It would be even more if financing was monitored instead of more important things like strangling Cuba, for example. That does succeed and has succeeded. Then comes the constituency, which is far more important. Here we have a choice. We can help the terrorist vanguard mobilize the constituency by violence, which of course they're happy to have as a contribution to proving that they're doing the right thing, or we can address the reasons why the constituency is there. The constituency may be people who hate the terrorists and fear them, but nevertheless perceive that somehow their cause is right and just because they're struggling against real grievances. That's exactly what happened with Muqtada al-Sadr, according to the Western polls. His respect shot up because he was the only person standing up to the American occupation. Well, okay, that's the way you can mobilize a constituency. And you can mobilize support for al-Qaeda by violence, as the examples I mentioned showed, or you can pay some attention to the grievances. And when you do, you find that many of them are quite legitimate, and you ought to deal with them quite apart from any relation with terror. But if you do that, then that reduces the threat of terror. And there's plenty of examples of that too. Britain and Northern Ireland is a perfectly good example, right next door. As long as England reacted to IRA terrorism with violence, it was a gift to the most militant elements in the IRA. It led to more terror and more support. As soon as England began finally paying some attention to the grievances, which were quite legitimate, things moved in another direction. Northern Ireland's a far more peaceful place than it was 10 years ago. And there are many examples of that, and it's well understood. The reason that path isn't taken is because the great powers don't want to attend to the grievances. It's another matter of priority. Having terror is less important than having to deal with the grievances and giving up some privilege and power. But there are many examples. Now, it's not that violence can't succeed.